Hello, everybody. Welcome to MIDC's Walks and Talks series. I'm your host, Mark Rupert. The topic of today's talk will be about the self-sufficient and sustainable Agri-Precinct designed for Western Sydney. Giving the talk today is our guest, Lee Allen. He's Director of Urban Design and Landscape Architecture at GHDWoodhead in Sydney. He's been working around the globe and extensively in the Middle East before relocating to Australia, where he is now. Welcome, Lee.
Thank you.
Lee has brought a couple of individuals with him. One is Michael White, Technical Director, Natural Resources and Agriculture. Prior to joining GHD, Michael was working in agricultural finance for 25 years and has extensive experience in the agricultural sectors. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Mark.
And finally, we have Ton Dijkgraaf, Strategy and Innovation Leader at GHD Digital. Ton leads GHD's Smart City and Places and Digital Transport Strategy. So thank you for joining us, gentlemen, and for taking the time to talk today. Before we get started, I want to make a note to the audience that you can submit any questions during the talk on the questions and questions board. And we will try to get all of your questions in at the end of the talk. Lee, the floor is yours.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Mark. Okay. Hopefully you can all see my screen.
We can see you and your screen.
Perfect. Well, thanks for the introduction, Mark, and thanks to Warwick Hatfull for reaching out and requesting an invitation, asking us to present here with you. And thank you all for tuning in, turning up, turning on. I know I'm going to have to work really hard to keep your attention. It's quite distracting, these events during work hours, so I'll do my best. As per Mark's introduction, I have lived and worked in the Middle East for a few years. I arrived when the Burj Khalifa was called the Burj Dubai, and it was only 40 stories high. And the first pillars of the Dubai Metro were just being put in place. So some of you might be able to date the year from that information. I lived in Dubai for 5 years, and I lived in Qatar for 5. And over the past 5 or 6 years, I've been working in the GHD Abu Dhabi office while based in Sydney, actually working with Mark and Warwick and perhaps a couple of others as well who are involved. I've got a real appreciation for the Middle East, and in particular the natural environment, and I also know how highly fragile and vulnerable it is, particularly in its need to support the growing population. And it's that awareness really that has catalyzed and inspired the presentation today, that in some ways aims to address these issues, not just in the Middle East, but also on a global scale as well. About a year ago, maybe 18 months, we were asked by a local transport agency who were delivering a new metro line in Western Sydney to provide ideas about how new metro and rail infrastructure could not simply just complement urban development, but actually be a city changing component. Really looking into the future about how the transport corridors and investment could have a positive effect on our new cities. And we continue to think about that. Over the past year, it really has developed and evolved and taken on a bit of a life of its own. And I think we're all well aware of the critical crossroads in our civilized history. I think it's fair not to understate that, of how we really need to be very careful and use our urban development to address many of the sustainability and environmental issues we're facing. A newspaper ran the headline fairly recently stating that we have 10 years left to save the world. And I think that's actually a fair and reasonable comment. And hopefully this type of development can help to address and contribute to that. So that's how the Agri-Precinct was formed. And we have a vision to begin with to guide the development of the design. We were looking for something that was self-sustaining, a precinct, an area that could provide the community with its own energy and resources and food and water provided within the development. It also needed to be carbon and environmentally positive as much as possible, and actually looking to be restorative. So restoring soils, habitat, improving water quality, improving the air quality. So it became restorative and actually started to contribute back into the environment. It needed to provide a foundation for jobs and economic improvement. We're moving away from a carbon-based economy in many countries around the world, but those jobs need to be filled. New jobs need to be created. And within the Agri-Precinct, we're looking at innovation and tech, but we're also looking at the future of food as well, which Michael will talk about in a bit more detail. And that's a rapidly changing, very exciting economic sector. And perhaps above all, in order for it to succeed as an urban area, it needed to offer a great place to live and support healthy lifestyles. In particular, in Australia, we have been offered the Australian dream. We had our own villa on a block of land that allowed us to socialise and perhaps have our barbecues and car and all the benefits of a modern lifestyle. But that's increasingly becoming unacceptable. And that's a story that's been repeated in many of the civilized worlds, and also the emerging and developing countries as well, where most of the population are now living in smaller accommodation. So access to public space, access to social opportunities in terms of interaction, walkability, access to nature is really important in a public realm, not something that is to be overlooked as we look through this concept. So there's quite a few drivers. COVID has been a big change. People are now looking at amenities and facilities that are decentralized, places that they can live and work within a walking distance of their own communities. It's responding to huge investments in infrastructure. That's true in Australia, but also around the world, as we anticipate a greater demand for the future of non-car dependent transport alternatives. It often is developed in greenfield locations, and we need to recognise the value of those greenfield locations if that has to happen. Looking at the opportunities to secure and protect and conserve soils, and also the knowledge. There are many farms in the Middle East that have been in operation for generations, and we know that they're quickly disappearing in the face of urban development, but there's a great knowledge wealth there in agriculture and soils and working with the land and the climate. And it's not just the land that we need to protect, but it's also the intelligence and that knowledge that's being passed on as a specialised skill. There's changes in food production. We're looking at different ways and methods and technology of how food is produced on a smaller scale, perhaps moving more away from a meat-based diet to a plant-based diet. And what does that mean to the practicalities of providing Those kind of innovations integrated into urban areas and cities. Climate adaptation is really prevalent, particularly acutely in Western Sydney, but also the rising temperatures are creating more uncomfortable urban areas. The integration of green infrastructure, of plants, of agriculture, of aquaculture, all have positive benefits in terms of making the climate and microclimate much more livable. We've got a growing population, and we know that there's not enough resources to support that growing population in the future. We can't continuously take away existing habitat. So the cities and the urban areas have to work harder. They have to provide, they have to be providing the resources to support that growing population from 7.7 billion today to 9.7 billion in 2050. So in 30 years, an extra 2 billion people. And of course, low carbon lifestyle is the default, is the baseline for what we need to do. And actually, that is a positive. We're seeing that the growth in the middle classes around the world are more aware of the issues, are more economically mobile, and they're looking to buy into and live these low carbon lifestyles that perhaps were only available if you were willing to relocate to rural isolated areas and live off grid. The new Agri-Precinct can offer these same aspirations, but in an urban location. So our concept was around measuring our success in these 5 key areas: energy, resources and materials, drinking water and treatment of wastewater, and our calories as well. And that's a big variable. It really depends on a lot of factors. And to meet the aspiration of being entirely self-sufficient, it means a lot of things have to change. Lifestyles have to change, attitudes towards agriculture, our diet, what's acceptable and not needs to be addressed. We can't continue to have a predominantly meat-based diet, and that is changing for lots of reasons. And it's a good trend and it's a good direction. And the more it moves towards a plant-based diet, the facts are we can have a more space efficient, a more carbon efficient supply chain. So in terms of size and space, our current model, proof of concept, is a population of around 25,000 people. And we're looking at providing 800 hectares of agricultural land, which is currently in addition to 24 hectares of solar and wind capture. Now, some of the key features of the precinct. The story started with the introduction of the new rail and transport corridor. If we have the opportunity when we're developing new developments in greenfield sites, the recommendation would be to take wide corridors of land along the transport networks and make them work harder, make them have a multifunctional purpose and role. We need them to make them work much harder. Here you can see that we have wetland water treatment and storage. There's solar capture, wind capture, opportunities for urban agriculture. At GHD, we're developing a lot of initiatives around hydrogen as an alternative type of fuel storage, and also introducing and creating and maintaining and restoring habitat and green links so that we can provide connections between developments and different areas for active transport, for cycling and pedestrians. Microagriculture is perhaps what we're considering more because of the practicalities of integrating it into an urban agriculture. Less on a commercial scale, more micro agriculture. And this allows us to create jobs. It also creates a sense of belonging and a sense of well-being, where the community are able to not only be part of the growing process, but also benefit from the produce at a local scale and feel ownership and value the land. The microagriculture might have a range of different products that we're looking at delivering in addition to food. There is the opportunity, if established early on in the process, to grow building materials, straw, byproducts, the agriculture process, bamboo, rapidly renewable materials that can be used for insulation. They can be used for other building materials that are organic, and they are rapidly renewable. And that's an important part of the microagriculture offering for these types of developments. It offers food security as well, which has been really quite a key issue this year in terms of COVID and the limited amount of travel, not only internationally, but also in some cases from neighbourhood to neighbourhood. And what does that mean in terms of food security for different types of community? Innovation hubs. This really is an idea that could go in many different directions. Not really too much value in going into the vast array of different innovative opportunities in agriculture, but the idea is that it's implemented at the very early stages of the new development. We produce iconic centres, iconic research, iconic architecture, and we use these to attract investment and catalyse interest from the private community as well as the government funding. Use these for educational facilities, for research facilities, and for private enterprise, and really use this as an opportunity to develop thinking and innovation in agriculture. In the less dense populated areas, we want to provide the opportunity for the carbon positive lifestyle. That's providing walkable communities where there are great access to public transport, cycle links, pedestrian links. They are tree lined, they are comfortable, they're protected from the shade, they allow people to interact socially at ground level, they're green and allow people to connect back with the natural world. For the private development and the private lots, there's different types of mechanisms, but we would perhaps consider incentivising some way private developers to meet the highest sustainable standards, to make sure that they're maximising the opportunities for reuse of water, water treatment, and even agricultural opportunities within their private lots. The Sustainable Urban Centre is more of a highly populated area with a range of different facilities, commercial, office, residential. The ground floor is retail, food and beverage. You know, we know what makes great cities and great streets, and this is an opportunity to do just that. One differentiator here is the introduction of vertical farming, which provides jobs. It perhaps provides cooling, the opportunity for cleaning our resources, but it also engages with the commercial activities here as well, where previously we measured sustainable restaurants with low food miles. This perhaps goes one step further from shelf to plate, and it doesn't get the logistics and the transportation and the food freshness issue is a lot of those issues are addressed in having that close proximity. And ideally, these are set within a wider framework of habitat and biodiversity, acting as a carbon sink, helping to mitigate issues with climate change, heat, flooding, the opportunities for the carbon exchange of soil, of waste materials, and also providing green links for, again, pedestrians and cyclists to move between one place and another in a cool, shaded, attractive environment. Here in Sydney, we have a phrase, or we have an initiative by the City of Sydney Council called the Green and the Blue Grid. And that covers the entire metropolitan area. And the aim is to connect the entire city through green networks, which are planted areas, natural or other, and blue networks, which is our alignment of creeks. And this could very easily and simply be translated to the same concept in the Middle East of the wadis. So protecting that very valuable riparian water creek area, valuing that as the most important part of the restoration and conservation and rehabilitation of ecological areas. One thing that is quite specific to a development that is happening after the infrastructure is implemented is the phasing. I worked on a large metro project here in Sydney over the last few years, and one of the burdens of developing a station in a greenfield site is that it doesn't reach capacity for many years, sometimes decades. They sit within acres of large undeveloped area. It is a natural attraction for businesses and development over time, but it doesn't happen overnight. And in order to address that, we'll be looking at a couple of different strategies. One is to incentivize and encourage the innovation facilities to create jobs, bring the people, they will want to live there, and job creation is an important part of the strategy that needs to happen at the very early stages. And thirdly, the establishment of an agricultural commercial activity. So that's already beginning to stimulate the economy. It's been productive, and it's utilising the undeveloped land that is around these stations. I have mentioned the importance of providing food, the importance of providing building materials, but one other important factor of establishing agriculture at day one, it allows the establishment of a green planted network within which to develop your residential commercial facilities, rather than build the building and provide the green infrastructure, the trees, the green space after, which then takes a further 5, 10, 15 years to come to maturity. And the intention here is that we look at that the other way around and working within a green framework that's established at the very outset of the project. And finally, phase 4 is, of course, when it's full and it's supporting a healthy, self-sustained community. During the development of the Agri-Precinct, we have really benefited from our access to a wide range of different disciplines and specialists within one organisation, albeit global. It's a well-connected organisation that has many different disciplines and expertise that we're able to draw upon to provide something that is not simply a visual concept. It's also founded in reality and buildability and practicality. And these are just a few of the more the roles of the more important players over the last few months in putting this together. We have had support from the energy modelers. We've had input from architects and architectural design and urban design, looking at circular economy principles for our resources. Michael and perhaps Paul will talk about their expertise in agribusiness and the understanding of how investment is increasing in this area. We're looking at digital delivery using GIS information. We have a whole department, sector, interest group, service line, call it what you will, for renewable energy, carbon calculating, mobility, which is sustainable transport, and it extends to others such as contamination, hydrology, project management. And all of these knowledge contributions that we're able to work with in a collaborative way, the stronger and more efficient and a better outcome our solutions are. This is an interesting example of a win that we gained over the last couple of months, working closely with the energy modelling team. They were able to take the raw digital 3D model and assign different values to the different building types, the different floor types, the glazing, the insulation, the roof type. Was it a green roof? Was it an exposed roof? The solar orientation. Looked at the population, the inhabitants, the users, and were able to develop quite a detailed energy model and provide a high-level dashboard of what would be the output based on the default, as is, business as usual solution. And from that point, they were able to make some quite interesting findings. They realized that the vertical farm element was quite significant in terms of its demand for energy. And that begins to suggest that the Agri-Precinct and this type of development may not be justifiable in all locations. In areas that have a large amount of agricultural land within close proximity to the urban areas, perhaps not. But areas such as highly developed areas such as Hong Kong, Singapore, and considering the pressures of the increase in population, more and more countries and cities will be seeing the balance of that shift so that it does become a justifiable, economic, valuable proposition. And again, Michael will talk briefly about Singapore's commitment by 2030. So that moved on to the next step of the building modelers analysis. Here is the baseline. And strategy by strategy, they were able to reduce the energy demand by looking at the building model and changing and tweaking and altering different components of the built form, the structure and the design. One particularly interesting finding was the issue of integrating vertical farms within a large building. And what they found is that inhabited areas which were used for offices or residential, produced a lot of heat. They produced a lot of waste carbon dioxide. And that is exactly what vertical farms need. The vertical farm element were able to transform the CO2 into oxygen, and the oxygen and the filtered air and the cooler temperatures were in turn able to benefit the commercial and office spaces. So by sharing those two uses on the same floor plate, there was an ability to reduce the overall energy demand for that building. They also found that introducing atrium and daylighting would have a significant effect on the lighting and cooling and heating demand of the building. And that was used by the architects to inform some of the architectural concepts that we developed following that analysis. We also work with the GIS team, looking at parametric design. So the designs which we've developed have been done using parameters. The buildings must be no more than 10 stories high. The footprint must be no more than 50% of the lot size. The floor space must not exceed a certain metre squared. In this particular instance, we were looking at increasing the solar access to particular facades of the building, which informed the best location for the vertical farm floors, and began to inform the actual shape the envelope as well. So this is an online platform, and from this data and information, we can generate and access all kinds of data that could be used by the wider team. We can look at how much floor space is available for the agriculture. We can apply metrics to the efficiency of that. We can identify the transport modeling, energy loading, massive amounts of data. It's online, it can be edited live, and the information can be extracted in real time. More recently, we've started to drill down into a bit more detail and granularity of the precinct. And here, one of our architects has developed a model based on information from our GIS team and the ArcGIS urban model, and also from the data provided by the energy model. So you can see here where we have atriums and open areas that go through the building blocks. And we also have, which is a little bit more difficult to see, but the front side of the building is where the vertical agriculture is proposed, and behind is the commercial inhabited spaces. And we're looking closely at how the closed loop of resources can work, using water as a good example, capturing rainwater, reusing it through the building, cleaning it on the roof through aquaculture, using it for irrigation and maintenance. And that's, where possible, a closed circular principle. Same with organic material. We're taking waste from the buildings, organic waste from the building, organic waste from aquaculture, the nitrates, we're using it as fertilizers to grow the agriculture. And then in turn, the agricultural produce is used at ground level. It's sold, it's used in restaurants, and we have the opportunity for farmers markets and bringing the community together. And finally, the idea here of the closed loop for water, for air and heat between the buildings in a lateral circular motion. So I think I'm going to hand over to Ton, if we have managed to get Ton to join us in the meeting.
I believe he is here. Ton, are you, your mic is on.
Thank you, Lee. Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lee. As Lee just explained, what we're seeing is developing a complex ecosystem of supply, demand, and mobility in how people use and interact with that environment is no different. If I take back a little bit how, as Lee described as well, and how we sort of came to this concept, for me it was a realization of in our own family environment is how we were buying food, where we were consuming, how we were consuming food. We had to go out to the shops. Where was that food coming from? And being a Dutchman, I knew a fair bit of logistics. Logistics, technology, people movement, it all sort of came together. And some years back, I created an idea of an Agri-Precinct for which we did a proposal for in Western Sydney. And with that concept, we show that logistics, technology, food can be both benefit to the economy, can be benefit to the people themselves. And what I've developed here with Lee is that we are integrating that into the urban environment. And the reason for this is quite clearly explained. There's a two-way relationship between the production of food and pollution in our environment. You know, agriculture, where it is one of the single largest contributor to pollution in our environment. It's the production that we put into the emissions that we create. It comes back to the produce, and what we're seeing is that, you know, all the crop losses can go up to 16% of soy, wheat up to 12%. So it's like this circular complex ecosystem, because we have food removed from where we are, driving up logistics cost, and where we access it, how we access it across the world. So we actually have an issue where where how we consume and where we grow food it's an impacting on our food security. So how can we change all of that? How we can bring food closer? How to reduce the distance? How do we change how we interact with food and reduce the footprint that food has on our society? And movement is of course very closely integrated with that. It's the time that we spend on the road in mechanical, propulsion transport. It's the increased investment that we need to have in the infrastructure for that. Is diversifying our energy supply for it. So it all is a complex system, and how this all comes together. So what we're looking to see is how do we actually drive this change in the in the circular environment of the Agri-Precinct. Next slide, please, Lee. So with that comes the methodology of how can we avoid where I have to go and get my food? How can I shift? Can shift our thinking about food. Can the food come to me? What sort of food is coming to me? Is the right food coming to me? And then improve. How do we comprehensively look at the challenges of how food is being distributed and the supply and demand? What are we growing? Are we growing the right food that the community demands from us? And if it doesn't, what's the impact if we have to source that from somewhere else? How do people access that food? Can they cycle? Can they walk? Do they have to go to the city to get that food? And there will be a balance of this. As somebody highlighted to me, I still like to get my Parmesan cheese from Italy, right? We can't grow everything locally. But how can we, with technology, monitor our consumption of food and make sure that we have the local foods for the community close by and grow them close by, fresh and organic where possible. So to do all of this, we have a governance model, governance operating model that really looks ongoingly at all these challenges and looks at the inputs, the metrics and the outputs, which is of the funding that can all come together, and think about the wider system. How do we personalize that? What edge issues have our local youth and local communities have that we can address? What sort of level of uncertainties around that? And that smart design, how do we collaborate? How do we analyze and get the right transport options for this? So GHD is already doing some of this work in early stages. We're looking at people movement. Where do people go? How do we change the design of the environment to work with people rather than against people? So great work with movement strategies. There's also some work being done in how freight is impacting the community. So we're doing for the city of Melbourne, we are looking at how the massive infrastructure commitment that needs to be had just to move freight across the city of Melbourne, and how could we do that differently? There's areas, and particularly in the Netherlands, that are a precedent for this. There's the city of Utrecht, and they have a suburb, if you call it, called Merwede. It's where the Netherlands is looking at what's the impact on the community if we just have walking and cycling infrastructure, and people have to go outside of the precinct to access the train and bus transport systems, or even park their car outside of the ecosystem rather than have it close to your home. So there will be changes. We're monitoring those trends to see how people react to all of that and how can we incorporate that into our Agri-Precinct model. But at this point in time, I think we have a quite solid approach, methodology to address these challenges going forward, and how we model and integrate that into the Agri-Precinct philosophy. Back to you, Lee.
Thank you very much, Ton. Very insightful. Ton's been a real integral part of the development of the Agri-Precinct from really the emergence of it, and I think moving towards these metrics and technologies is really important going forward. I'm going to hand over to Michael now, who's going to talk through some fairly complex issues in a very short space of time. So I'll do the slides, Michael, and you do the speaking.
Thank you, Lee. And we certainly appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation today, and I'll get through as much as I can in the 5 minutes. In terms of what's happening in agricultural circles globally, I suppose an interesting factors in theory, the world's producing enough calories right now for everybody, and the difference between developed and developing countries is all around the food waste. In developed countries, there is a lot of food that is just thrown away, which makes me sad when you think about the energy that goes into producing it. In developing countries, the metric's a little bit different, where the logistics and infrastructure isn't quite there to allow delivery to port effectively. Globally, however, and Lee mentioned this, there's a lot of discussion around security across a variety of themes. And when people think about security, defense comes to mind. But increasingly, food security and water security are becoming increasing focal points for governments, individuals, entities across the board. And that is no different to the UAE. That first slide, you're probably well aware of it. The Abu Dhabi Investment Office has allocated $100 million specifically to ag tech investment, and AeroFarms, a US-based vertical farming entity, are tapping into that to potentially build one of the largest vertical farms in the world. And this isn't some sort of pipe dream. If I look at the global picture at the minute, in the first half of the year, of this calendar year, there was close to $8.8 billion of investment globally in ag and food tech initiatives around the world. And that's Ag Funder have reported this, and it's split pretty evenly between upstream and downstream. And when I talk about upstream, it's in ag biotech, farm robotics, novel farming systems, and farm management software. But interestingly, downstream also, there's a level of investment into in-store restaurant, retail, online, e-grocery, restaurant marketplaces. Some of the themes that we're talking about in this concept of the Agri-Precinct, and a lot of that is around big data. But at its core, regardless of whether you're talking about upstream or downstream investment, it is all around food security. And Lee also mentioned Singapore, for example, of government-led investment, and they've got a target to produce 30% of their local food production requirements domestically by 2030. And in many respects, when you think about a country of the size of Singapore, the only way is up, and aquaculture and alternative proteins will be a big part of that as well. Where's the money coming from? It's a mix of government and also institutional investors and private investors who are coming to the fore. The next slide there details the UAE's strategy by 2051, and myself and some colleagues had the privilege and pleasure of hosting Her Excellency to a forum in our Sydney offices about 2 years ago now, where we were discussing these very themes. And from afar, it's very pleasing to see that coming to reality. And those three criteria that I mentioned there about knowledge, and that comes to Ton's point earlier about where the food's coming from, what's required, what production capacity is there, and what are the processing and nutritional needs moving forward, are three very clear themes of the UAE's focus moving forward. If I can go to the next slide, Lee, there are a number of drivers pushing these themes, and they're nothing new to the people listening on the call there, but the world's population is growing. There's an increasing level of demand for safe food, and the food security challenges that I mentioned earlier, largely also borne out through the last 6 months that we've lived through regarding COVID, but equally consumer preferences and demands. People definitely want to know where their food's coming from and what the qualities are, and unlocking market access. And in my day-to-day job here for GHD, there's a lot of my effort and time goes into market access, particularly for a country like Australia. We're in the privileged position where 70% of our food that is produced and agricultural commodities are exported. So market access is a big theme for our day-to-day work. And I might go to the next slide, Lee, if that's all right. But there's also threats, and they're not things that can't be overcome, but certainly when we think about food and food production, there's levels of competition globally. The cost of producing food is certainly not diminishing, and I think that is an area that people need to get used to, because if you want quality, then it needs to be paid for. Climate change globally is a huge threat, and certainly here in Australia, the ever-presence of extreme variables of droughts and floods and localized natural disaster events can have big impacts on domestic production. And in conjunction with Ton and Lee, that's what sparked my interest in joining GHD to explore the opportunities for urban and peri-urban agriculture, because increasingly we are seeing that happen around the world, and the concept we're talking about for Western Sydney is there. The final thing there is the rapid digitisation and technology uptake, and the ag funder stats I mentioned earlier are all mentioned around and through the concept and lens of ag tech and food tech, and they are interlinked. There's nothing that you can't disseminate from in terms of the need for data, and people are craving it, and certainly some of those downstream investments I mentioned earlier are all linked to those big data platforms. I might go to the next slide, Lee, if that's all right. This is an old slide, but just to give you a bit of a snapshot of some of the food and beverage clients that GHD deals with in a global sense. And as you can see there, the locations of the yellow dots are largely where GHD offices were located, and it's natural that those offices attract certain clients in certain locations. But that doesn't mean that we're certainly beholden to that. We have a presence obviously in the Middle East and more recently in Singapore, and we work as one GHD. So even though that Lee and Ton and I are in different divisions, one of the great pleasures I have in working with GHD is the ability to link with like-minded colleagues and leverage our collective thought processes for broad benefit, if you like. I think there was one more slide, Lee, from memory. Yep, this is something that our natural resource and ag team developed in terms of how we think about food and agribusiness as an industry, and it's certainly not the be-all and end-all, but certainly from our perspective, we think of things through the lenses of producers, processors, and distribution channels, and then going across the line, that creates a need to think across, what are the policy and advocacy requirements across those three tiers? What are the enablers to make that happen through research, technology, and finance? And finally, what are the infrastructure needs across water, energy, fuel, waste, transport, and communications? And ideally, that should be in a circle, but we've just created that laterally and horizontally to make ourselves think about how these things are all interlinked, because there's a heavy reliance on all parties attached to food production to make things work. And there's not one area that I've seen in isolation that can simply get on with life without having some sort of reliance on other areas, be it policy or finance or infrastructure, just to name a few. And they're almost hand in hand, and that is the whole of supply chain approach. Just to close and to think through where the capital's being allocated at the moment, if I think through those ag funder numbers that I mentioned earlier, the US is by far and away the most dominant investor at the moment, followed by China. But on a par, if I go down the line towards that sort of $100 million mark that was mentioned earlier from a UAE perspective, that's on par with Canada, a little bit below Singapore, and Australia is not far behind that as well. But equally, the big movers, I think, are also India and also Israel, who aggressively invest in ag tech, and that is also built around food security and water security as well. Having said that, just in closing, the concept design that Lee's been promoting, I think, is particularly exciting because it's applicable not just in developing countries, or developed, but also developing countries, and is scalable. It can be applied in a major metropolitan area like Sydney, or in a regional town at different levels. And equally, I think the opportunity to apply some models like that in developing countries in particular is to me where some of the greatest benefit is potentially going to come from. So thank you, Lee. I went slightly over 5 minutes, but I'll close there.
That's fine, Michael. And again, Michael was another key advisor really to the whole process, and has been for as long as the idea has been around, and also stepped in at the last minute. Paul unfortunately wasn't able to make it today for travel commitments, so thanks for that. I'm going to wrap up pretty quickly, Mark. I know we've only got a few minutes left. There are things that are already happening around the world. This is not entirely new. In fact, it's an idea that's been going for thousands of years. In China, there's Zhongyan, which really is looking to be entirely self-sustaining, inspired by COVID. And they're looking to test the limits of what can be done innovatively, which I thought was a real great aspiration. Sustainable City is in the Middle East, in the UAE, and it's been established and built, and it's got inhabitants and has been around for several years. And it's a fantastic example, a really brave example of what's happened in the UAE. And I recommend, if you want to know more, there's a great video on YouTube for that one. And Ton also mentioned Merwed, not specifically food secure, but it's great here to see a real brave move by the government to implement something which is car free, essentially. One car or one shared vehicle per three households. That's a great step forward. What I might do, Mark, is I'm going to run this video, but it's silent, and maybe I can hand back to you and we can see if there's any questions or comments that people want to chip into.
Sounds good, Lee. There are quite a few questions, so we'll just throw them at you and see how far we get. How does that sound?
Yeah, let's go.
All right, great. So the first one is essentially, is there a goal for how much the concept will be giving back? We mentioned carbon neutral, we mentioned carbon positive, completely off the grid. I mean, do you have a specific goal in mind of what to achieve or how much to achieve this project?
It's highly variable. Anything is possible if you have the land to do that, but as we know, urban development, we don't have that luxury, and we want to minimize the footprint. So it's going to be a constant challenge to minimize the urban development to provide self-sufficiency and carbon neutrality before we can think about being restorative on all fronts. You know, Mazda committed to be carbon neutral almost 20 years ago, which was very brave. We'd like to do the same, but it's a work in progress. And it depends on a lot of factors.
Fair enough. You mentioned the sustainable city in the UAE. Are there any other places that you would think that this could be activated, this concept could be activated? Or the question specifically is based on your experience in the UAE. Where do you see something like this concept being applied? I know you mentioned sustainable city. Is there another one, maybe? Or is that your?
Well, I think in terms of examples, there's lots of initiatives happening throughout the Middle East on small scales. I remember turning up to Musharraf, the heart of Doha, 10 years ago, and they had a chicken outside their office, and I was just baffled to why that was the case. But actually, that was to find a credit to comply with the LEED certification that said you must have some food production as part of your development. It's very tokenistic. It was a great, you know, capture the imagination. So things are happening on small and big scales. One particular one which it really stuck in my mind was by a large water development company in the Middle East, who had a labour camp just to the west of Dubai, sorry, to the east of Dubai, entirely self-sustainable. 30 labourers or so living in cargo shipping containers, closed loop water. It went through permaculture, it went through reed bed treatment. The water grew vegetables, the vegetables went crazy. The labourers got out in the shade at the end of the day and had access to fresh fruit and vegetables. The black water, grey water cycle, it was a work of art. So yeah, it's happening in lots of locations, and it's only going to increase.
Great, thank you. How does the precinct address COVID? I'm not sure that there was really any dialogue specific to it. There was comments and slides that showed it, but not really specifics.
Yeah, I think it's a topical comment. There's a couple of things. One is that we're really finding that we're spending more time at home, so the quality of our environment, built environment in our local areas is much more important, and the quality of that and the opportunities for people to socialise locally is really changing the way that particularly public realm is designed and regarded since post-COVID. And that's, you know, integrating green infrastructure and planting can only be a good thing to contributing to that. And then of course the other perhaps more important issue is security, food security. And if there's restrictions on travel and transport internationally or even locally, then perhaps this can contribute to that in some way.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Thank you. Basically, you mentioned the vegetarian lifestyle being more efficient. Can we make the assumption that this is because it takes more to grow animals than it does vegetables, the like?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the soybean is one of the most space efficient produce in terms of calorie production, and you know, the worst is probably you know, the meat, beef, dairy kind of processes. So that's the way we need to head, and I'm pleased to say that a lot of people are taking that up. Perhaps you're partial to the odd vegetarian meal, Mark.
I lean that way. I can't say I'm 100% there, but I lean that way. I try. So, okay, really, when you were talking about micro agriculture, can you define that a bit more? What your definition of micro agriculture is? Is it just smaller farming, or what are we talking about here? If you don't mind.
Yeah, I guess it's, I could easily describe it what it's not. It's not macro agriculture on a commercial scale that we see across the wheat belts of America and in Western Australia that are tremendously harmful to the environment. Micro agriculture takes many different forms. It could simply be growing tomatoes on your window box outside of your apartment, and it could be commercialized, but on a small scale specialization. So yeah, real varied opportunities there, and exciting.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to keep throwing these questions at you. So are you considering vertical farming for the exterior building faces only, or are you going much further, you know, and trying to make it more densely stacked sort of environment so you can maximize your results, if you will? Then potentially going over to solar, going into infra.
Yes. Well, the technology is there to have them within the building. It doesn't, in fact, a lot of the imagery and calculations we've done, we've assumed that the agriculture would be on the floors, and perhaps you could have various stacked growing levels within one floor. So one floor has essentially 3 floors of growing area, and all sorts of techniques to increase the efficiency. It's the balance again has to be careful. You know, you would need perhaps solar power for renewable energy, but does that really stack up when you've got open space outside that would grow from natural daylight? So you have to pick the right location to do that. But you get your 24-hour growing opportunity under LEDs. So space efficiency is more important than, it can work.
Okay. In the renders you showed, what was the structure over the train lines? There was this staggering of structures going along the trainway?
Well, should I say sex cells? I have a difficulty in some of the most basic things are the most important things, like worm farms. We have a colleague who has a small fish tank which is below a tray of tomatoes, and it's just simply pumping water around. Those are the wins. That's what should be selling things, but unfortunately we need to put these on LinkedIn and capture the imagination, as you know. I'll not say any more about that.
Fair enough.
We could wrap that in solar cells as well.
Absolutely. We're going magnetic with the trains, I swear. All right, let's see. We've got another one for you here. Do you believe that the district can be applied to any existing urban areas? And do you have optimal district master plan designs from scratch? I think we did hear a little bit to that effect, that it could be applied, but maybe you can add some more to that.
I think it's potentially more challenging to retrofit and integrate into existing urban areas, but not impossible. And you would say, as Michael referred to earlier, it's scalable. So perhaps in areas that are seeing a drop in demand for commercial office space, could be ideal locations for a mushroom farm or a piece of urban agriculture. The car parking space that perhaps is no longer required. Buildings can be adapted, and perhaps architecture needs to build in that flexibility going forward as well. So it doesn't always need to be a greenfield site, but works even more easily, I suspect. Okay, great. Thank you. Answer. Okay, does the food grown in a manufactured environment, vertical farms, hydroponics, etc., have the same health benefits necessary, microbes, etc., that are found in traditional organic farms? I'm not sure if we're stepping out a little bit too far, but maybe you can answer that. Well, probably stepping outside my specialised area. I don't know whether Michael has anything to add to that, but yeah, I think from an environmental point of view, it's a good thing. From a dietary point of view, let's say yes. Fair enough. Gotcha. Why do you think Dubai Sustainable City gets more publicity locally? That's an interesting question. Do you have a thought on that? Why does it not get more recognition locally? I think it's maybe not get more recognition locally. Yeah, it's a really great point. Doing an international search, that is one of the greatest examples in probably one of the most harshest environments. It's a great question. I think it should be celebrated more. I think people should feature in magazines. Perhaps it doesn't have the images. Yeah, doesn't have the sexy train wrap around. Maybe it needs a few loops over the top. Fair enough. Okay, got one more for you. Do you believe that large cities can be converted into a series of car-free agro districts connected by public transport? Okay, I think you did touch onto this. If you want to add to that, please feel free. But we did kind of go into the brownfield sites and whatnot, but feel free to add to it. Yeah, no, well, that's right. The Merwede example, the first people in Merwede is the Holland example of the car-free environment. It's under construction. They're due to have inhabitants in the next 3 or 4 years. So we'll probably see how that develops. Okay, great. I'm going to end it with one last question because I know your time, we're time sensitive here. But have you guys been able to do an economic model or feasibility study to validate your assumptions, your design assumptions? So there are some engineering assumptions made here, the closed loop, how that might, but is there something that validates it from a financial fiscal perspective? Yeah, I think that's a really, really great question. And I think the next step in this story is a cost benefit analysis. And TON in particular has developed similar tools where we can plug in the costs, the construction, the operation costs, how that affects the retail and commercial value of the land, and see how that can stack up. Great, thank you. I'd be very excited to see how that stacks up. I think we all would.
kind of ultimately validate the design, you know, to the next level. I think with that, we're done. I think we'll wrap the talk up today, unless you want to add anything, Lee.
That's all good, Mark. Thanks once again for the invite and the organisation.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, thanks, Lee, Michael, and Tom, and we'll see everybody at the next MIDC talk.